Would you like to begin now?
Yeah, I'm here with Jordan Hall, who has been a fascinating voice online and in a lot of different circles who are interested in processing what they call sense making in this new time that we're in. He's been talking about the shift in how we should process things and the shift in our institutions. And then, of course, with this pandemic, that conversation is even more pressing and more on the minds of people. So thanks for coming on the program, Jordan.
Yeah, nice to be here.
So what's your background though, and how did you get involved in these topics that you've been online about? People are watching you and they're seeing you engage with other thinkers, like-minded folks trying to think ahead of the curve and see what's coming along that the human species needs to get prepared for. But how did you start on this train of thought?
Well, I suppose maybe just keep it compact, to keep it simple. You might say that I'm a dilettante, well, or a polymath, depending on your preference. And I have an attraction to a certain class of kind of thinker and also kind of doing. So in the context of thinkers, the names that came up, we were just before we started recording, we were talking about McLuhan. So you might say that I'm an applied McLuhanite, but equally, John Boyd is somebody who I've been very influenced by, which is optimal when applied. Another philosopher, Manuel de Landa, I've also been very attracted to his work. There's a few more you could throw in, but if you kind of get the spread of those kinds of individuals, I like to read and always have, and was reading those kinds of thinkers relatively young. So that's one side. And then the other side is, when I say applied, I mean applied. So I actually was involved in three startup companies that went public in the latter part of the 20th century, earlier part of the 21st century, all in the context of decentralized media. So the first was called np3.com, if you recall, music. The second was a company called Interview, which ultimately was purchased by a company called Akamai, which you may be familiar with. And the third was called DivX, which played a major role in making the internet a visual medium. So all this video that we're doing, whether it's watching YouTube videos or doing Zoom calls, was kicked into gear, at least meaningfully, by the work that we were doing. And it's sort of a way of getting a sense of it. I think in 2004, maybe 2003, kind of in the middle of my DivX arc, I bought two books from Manuel de Landa and gave copies to like 150 people, including my entire executive team. So it's a good sense of like this notion of having a copy of Deleuze and Guattari on my lap as I was sitting in the waiting room to talk to Sergey Brin about Google making an offer to buy my company. So that combination, if you can have kind of that sensibility, that's probably a pretty good concrete, right? Sitting in the lobby, waiting to go talk to Sergey about buying DivX, while reading, maybe it was just Deleuze, maybe it was Difference in Repetition. I can't remember exactly, but you kind of get the gist. So that's a nice compact example that gives you the sensibility of it. Maybe one last piece is I'm currently actually sitting on my family's hilltop ranch in the Texas Hill Country. And we've been spending roughly half my time in what you might call thinking, and mostly these days actually turning a lot of the thinking that's been going on over the past 10 years into strategic planning around what might be trajectories from now. And the other half, planting raised bed gardens and moving limestone rocks from one place to another place.
So you're homesteading and all that kind of thing, huh?
Yeah, and that's not a new thing. We actually have an actual homestead.
And is there a particular reason for that? Just because of where you think things are heading, or just because of the pleasure and the desire to live that kind of lifestyle?
The pleasure and desire to live that kind of lifestyle.
Good. Well, that's. Do you think that all human beings should live close to that, if not doing it directly, but being close to people who are homesteading and providing products and milk and
the
vegetables?
word "all" is a pretty large logical category.
Right. Well, do you think it's natural for human beings to go into subterranean cattle cars and be shifted back and forth into big cities where they're,
Oh, definitely,
packed
it's
in?
definitely not natural.
That's
and
not
and
natural.
I would go further to say it's also almost certainly not healthy.
Right.
So if I were to say, like, the way I would say it is more like almost everyone, and for a sizable fraction of the time, should be doing the kinds of things that are part of the evolutionary arc of humans.
Hmm.
So staring at the fire, um, instead of staring at electric lights, for example,
Hmm.
and touching earth and planting things and being in sync with the rhythms of weather. Like, you should know what the weather's like outside without checking an app on your phone. Those are,
Hmm.
I think, good heuristics. I think very much in terms of heuristics and not in terms of um, categorical structures.
Right. Do you see that? Do you see a similar dynamic going on with what Peter Thiel talks about in terms of, we've had this great stagnation since the 1970s, and after we did the Man on the Moon, the last moon mission, we kind of seemed like we just stalled, and we've become more interested in innovating in the world of what he calls bits rather than atoms. That all the, when we think of technological progress, it's always in the world of AI or computer apps rather than in physical innovation. And because of that great stagnation in atoms, that's why we're in this kind of state of madness that we're in, where we don't know how to get along anymore, and we don't know how to process conflict in healthy ways. Do you see that dynamic?
Yeah, sure. In fact, to be very specific, I've known Eric Weinstein for, gosh, almost 15 years now, something like
Mm-hmm.
that, some significant amount of time before he met Peter. And I used to simplify things by just saying 1977. Now, that's obviously hyper simplistic, but yeah, very much so. There's a line somewhere in the 70s where something very significant changed,
Mm-hmm.
and so yes, I would put a lot of chips on that bet.
Right. Well, that's where I think there's a connection there with, the ending of the Bretton Woods system, with this idea of getting us off the last link to gold that Nixon did. That
There's some pieces there for sure.
there's this rise and this, central bank managed economy that's going to become the new, experiment that will take place worldwide. And I think that has some correlation to the stagnation in real wage growth and so on that has been seemingly a kind of sticking point for our culture, where we're starting to point fingers at each other. We're dividing based on gender and race and so forth. And this notion that if you cannot, markets can't really function if you don't allow them to truly expand and grow. And when they become kind of uh, a zombie market that's propped up by central bank and financial institutions that are just kind of creating this consumer consumption based economy rather than real, I guess, atomistic creation like we used to have, you're going to have this moment where we feel rich and we feel decadent, but there is a real shrinking pie at the real tangible, you know, point of living. There's a real cutthroat energy.
There's a whole lot that we could do in that zone. You can go all kinds of ways in that direction. So yeah, there's a lot there. You can think about maybe a very deep piece is the ungroundedness in general, the ungroundedness of culture in general. One aspect of which is the ungroundedness of money, but the ungroundedness of culture in general, and the capacity, and in some sense the tendency of culture and individual psychology to, what's the word the transhumanists use, to wirehead or to become
Mm-hmm.
delusional
Right.
when you are ungrounded. When you have the ability to take cocaine and to feel like you got tiger blood,
Right.
um,
Or
it can be
Tiger
very easy.
King. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was trying to reference Charlie Sheen's Little
Yeah, but I
America.
was just thinking about Tiger King. Everybody's watching Tiger King, thinking they're living a great life as their whole country is
As reality
dissolving.
isn't actually working out. Exactly. And I would say, from a McLuhan perspective, the rise of TV has an interesting correlation, like, the Nixon financial disconnect, and also the amount of time that our minds were living in a fantasy land,
Mhm.
stroboscopic light and increasingly stereoscopic sound, there's a correlation there. Those two pieces connect, and they're correlated, right? They're not strictly a causal, but they begin to build a fabric of a capacity to become increasingly disconnected from base reality, from the ground,
Right.
and there's a bunch of feedback loops that happen when that can occur.
You were mentioning some of the thinkers that you have been influenced by. One of the individuals that I've tried to popularize in my columns and in my radio and podcast work is Rene Girard, the anthropologist from Stanford. Have you engaged his work, and have you seen some insights there that have been helpful for your ability to look at this culture and this technology?
I have, although I have to laugh because, as you probably at this point, it's pretty self-evident to me that you're somewhat familiar with Peter. One of Peter's instincts and ethos is contrarianism, and I
Mhm.
would say that I am a Girard contrarian, and that's really just to say that I embed Girard's insight into a larger complex of the current best thinking around, for example, human development, both evolutionarily development and individual development, child development, psychology. And so my friend Zach Stein actually, I think, has got the best thinking on this because he's really an expert in development, and he's gone very deep into Girard. Um, a way of putting it is something like the mimetic desire is a real thing, but it's part of a larger complex of psychological, social, cultural, evolutionary, game theoretic constructs. And you can't, if you put your thumb on that scale, just like you put your thumb on any scale, you're going to end up getting a little bit confused. If you're not aware of it, you're also going to be a little bit confused. So that's the way I look at it.
It's interesting. So, would you say it also has a physics component? The same process that manifests as mimetic desire, as you said that there's an evolutionary, there's a psychological component to it that's deeper than just the surface of imitation of desires. Would there be a physical component to it too?
Well, the answer to your question is I've never thought that thought before, but when you put it in my mind, it feels like a very fun thought to think. So
Yeah.
I'd be very interested in contemplating it
Yeah.
or chatting about it.
Yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, is this idea that if you do see this symmetry of, desire, and you see it, you're right, it's not just in human desire. You look at animals and the symmetries of conflict and mating, and this little pattern that you see.
Yep.
It looks like it may go all the way down to the subatomic level, that there's this built-in mechanism that we express, and we talk about it as desire, but it actually looks a lot more fundamental to me than a word like desire can
This is real
encapsulate.
interesting. Now, I don't know how much as a matter of content, if your show kind of goes into the deeply esoteric, but we could, that's a rabbit hole I'd dive in real quick.
Sure,
Um,
yeah.
I think there's a lot. So one of the ways that I've thought about it, and this is I'm basically just applying a framework that I've used in the past that seems like it might roughly fit. Um, Not to overcode the domain we're at, but maybe to get some directions, maybe get some orientation on it. Is a distinction that I've made between what I call the rivalrous and the anti-rivalrous, which maps roughly to atoms and bits, as it turns out. Which, by the way, we should be very clear, the third term here, which we might consider energy, to be a process or a dynamic between the two. So atoms, bits, and energy feels like that's a pretty solid constellation. And the characteristic of the rivalrous is rivalry, a desire, competitive desire. The fact that at the end of the day, there are certain aspects of the physical universe, of which physics is largely the branch of science that studies that universe, that are at the bottom strictly not shareable, both in the sense that they are atomic, meaning that if you have it, I don't have it,
Mhm.
in some sense, and entropic, meaning that to the degree to which you interact with it in any way, you turn the free energy into entropy. You've depleted it permanently in a one-way direction. So there are certain aspects of the universe, the things that are studied by physics, that have those characteristics. And around those aspects, you would imagine that they would evolve. For example, as a fundamental characteristic of any system that, sorry, I have to back up. There's another component here which has to do with the irreducible necessity of the ability to accumulate an upgradient of that particular scarce, fundamental scarce aspect of reality in order to perpetuate dissipative systems, right? So we have another thing here, which a
I think
dissipative
you
system.
just channeled there for a second. I see that.
Yeah, well,
That was a
sometimes people
download.
say that. You might think
Yeah.
I was trying to think real deep.
Oh yeah, no, that's good.
The way this is actually a secret, but I'm pretty much a synesthete, and I don't actually think in words. Um, and so when I'm doing that, what I'm actually doing is trying to hold a particular. I kind of refer to it as a geometry, but it's almost a little bit more like. You ever seen those puzzles that are a 3D puzzle, but you're looking at it on a computer screen, so it's 2D?
Right. Yeah.
You have to rotate it and orient it until the 3D system pops and you see the 3D model.
Yeah.
A little bit like that. Like I'm actually moving things in some, I don't know, some
That's
interior
good.
space.
Yeah.
But once it locks, then I have to hold it because it's not easy to hold. But once I hold it, then I have to start figuring out how to pull the words out that the
Right.
word map to the thing, but the thing's the thing. And that may very well be what's referred to as channeling. But yeah, that little bit right there was a nice chunk of stuff. I'm reasonably confident. And okay, so you've got that. You've got dissipative systems, and you've got the reality that there's essentially a binary in dissipative systems, which is to say that either they are what Deleuze would call haesthetes. You might make a simpler term would be ephemeral, like
Okay.
a sirocco or a little breeze. It comes around and then it goes away, and so it evaporates. And then there are others that have a capacity to pull resources from their external environment, which now by definition are going to be rivalrous resources, to perpetuate their being what they are, a pattern that has the capacity to repeat itself over time. I'm pulling a lot of, right now, a lot of Deleuze, and to a lesser extent, Deleuze into that. So, and this, by the way, I had this conversation with Brett Weinstein about 12 years ago. We kind of were discussing ethics. We got down to the very bottom, which is, okay, we can make a proposition that we have a habit of thought which is based on a simple survivor's bias. We happen to be the leading edge of a 13.7 billion year survivor's bias of that tiny subset of all possible phenomena that didn't just evaporate back into the quantum foam. And then, so then started getting atoms, and the atoms became molecules and didn't evaporate back into the atomic, maelstrom. And the molecules became organic molecules, didn't just evaporate back, right? So that structural development, we have the survivor's bias of that. And kind of channel a little bit of Jordan Peterson here. If you plug him into that structure, you're like, yeah. And the narratives and mythopoetics and ethos and values that we happen to have sitting, that we sit on top of, are an expression of that entire arc, of which now we can plug mimetic desire is a real deep piece of that, which probably
Mm-hmm.
goes all the way down to the struggle between quarks to be the ones that actually turn into atoms, right there at that pivot point between to be and not to be, or to continue to be, to become in becoming, or to become nothingness again, is probably the pivot point. And if you anchor there and pull all the way back out, you can hold continuity from the quantum foam all the way up to complex cultures. I think then you've got a very fair frame to actually start really talking about the Girardian insight. But to remember that you're holding that piece of reality, which is the piece of reality that's talking about the rivalrous, talking about these characteristics of the sorts of things that physics studies. But then we have to talk about the other side, which has to do with creativity, emergence. And this is where Eric and I have still never yet figured out how to figure out our knife fight. And Brett, I think, sits in the middle of it, because he, at the end of the day, as an evolutionary theorist, cannot dispense with the notion of evolution. He cannot dispense with the notion that there is, in fact, change. That the sort of Newtonian, I call the simple Einsteinian model of a all at once static space-time continuum. The notion that there is, in fact, no novelty, that all has, in some sense, happened instantaneously, and that to the degree to which we perceive change, it's an illusion. From an evolutionary theory perspective, that isn't a good model. Right? An evolutionary theorist has to have at least some notion that you actually can go from 0 to 1. That you can go from what is to an entirely novel in time, some kind of actual novelty, like innovation. Novation exists as a part of ontology. Well, okay, that's the other piece, right? Novation cannot be strictly rivalrous, because at the very beginning, you're literally going from 0 to 1. You are in fact creating moreness. That piece is the piece that is not fully captured in purely mimetic desire, because you're actually creating something new. There is no copy there. So that would be the other piece that I would layer in to get a fully rich theory.
So you've got things like scarcity, and then this idea of maybe post-scarcity here, or this idea, like I'm thinking of the biblical story of Jesus when he's handing out the fishes and loaves, and he takes these fishes and loaves, but they just keep coming. He doesn't cut the fish up into pieces. All right, everybody get a little meat here. No, he's just like, nope. And it's this declaration of war against scarcity, right?
Yes.
And it doesn't require coercion to do. He doesn't say, all right, I'm forcing you to give me your food. He just voluntary exchange, and from that voluntary exchange, there's this renunciation of the confining power of scarcity, right?
Well, I mean,
that's creativity without conflict, right?
That's creativity. That's generativity. And as you notice, there's a whole bunch of characteristics. Like if you think about that particular parable, there's a mentality, there's a premise, there's a commitment to peace, for example. You can't, in fact, have generativity outside of peace. Peace is the space which gives rise to the possibility of true collaboration. Once you've achieved peace, you then have achieved the capacity to shift from a scarcity dynamic to an abundance dynamic. Plenitude as a secondary artifact, and I'm making that distinction. So I think of there being a scarcity mentality, and attached to the scarcity mentality, and we can actually shifting to the mythopoetic, I would tag the character of Mammon. And so Mammon is what happens when you operate with the scarcity mentality, but multiply by grotesquerie. So the Jabba the Hutt character. Jabba the Hutt has too much, but still is tied to a scarcity mentality and is trying to plug the hole of scarcity through getting more. Right? That's the wrong answer. Then you got another thing over here, which we can talk about Jesus in the parable, which is to say, no, we're actually going to move into the abundance mentality. We're going to move into a space that is anchored in a fundamental sense of orienting towards this other domain, the domain of creativity, the domain of generativity, the domain of novation, which first and foremost has to be held in a space of peace. But once we're in that space, we recognize that we're now in a place of plenitude, which doesn't necessarily even vaguely look like Jabba the Hutt, right? It actually looks nothing at all like that. Right. It's like a whole bunch of people who actually have to be conscious of the fact that to maintain the integrity of peace is the first thing you have to do. That's the beginning. If you can't maintain the integrity of peace, then the whole plenitude evaporates. And so therefore, each of us as an individual has to start taking responsibility for only taking that piece of the peace that is ours, and to carry the cross that is ours to carry fully and completely to maintain the integrity of that. That thing is the most sacred, the most sacrosanct. Sorry, I think I went off on a bit of a tirade there.
No, but it's this idea that you don't have to divide up the pieces that you have, that you can take what you have, and through voluntary sharing, you can alleviate the pressures of a scarce world. That you've got a whole crowd here who's hungry. Who's going to get fed first? That's the question you'd immediately think. Is it going to be the apostles, or is it going to be those who are richest in the crowd, who have fast passes to Disney World? Who's it going to be? Yeah. And this issue is not resolved by saying, okay, let's ration out what we have. We've got a basket of fish and loaves. Somehow, in that moment of voluntary sharing, scarcity is just overcome. It's just it's the scarcity is just thrown out the window, as if it doesn't actually bind up the universe after all.
Well, it's a lot of powerful stuff in there too, because if you think about it, there's a moment, there's a choice. And a big part of that choice has to do with fear. If you're able to choose in the face of fear, because at that moment there's a, hey, who's going to get the scarce fish and loaves?
Mhm.
And maybe if I'm fearful, if I allow fear to be my basis of choice, then I'll struggle to be the one who either A, gets it, or even better, gets to be the one who makes the determination. I want to be the boss. If there's going to be a boss, I want to be the boss. Or I just don't want to be the boss's crony. And you have to get past that. You have to find a way to get past that as the basis of choice. And this is a very nuanced thing I'm saying. I
Right.
don't mean be foolhardy. I don't mean numb yourself to the reality of the possibility of privation. What I mean is to not allow that to be the basis of your choice, to go deeper than that, not to ignore it, but actually to recognize that it's a real thing. It's a fundamental thing. It's a part of reality, but it's not the most fundamental part of reality. Below that, deeper than that, is that sense of, well, in this particular parable would be love, which is deeper than fear. And if you can anchor in that, then you begin to recognize that, if we voluntarily associate in this space of peace, we can in fact get past this problem, this necessity to begin competing with who's going to be the boss and who's going to be the crony of the boss, and most importantly, who's going to eat and who's not going to eat. And it has always been thus, right? So if you think about it as a narrative of the human experience, it's just trying to remind us of the fact that when we move ourselves into a mindset of scarcity, when we are moved from a basis of fear, we may believe that we have solved a problem, but we in fact have bitten off the biggest problem of all, which will inevitably end. Now we're in Girard land. We've anchored ourselves deeply in Girard land, and we know how that story ends. And therefore, we must always be mindful of the necessity of choosing not to go there, the necessity of choosing even when it is at its most challenging, to be anchored in that sense of love, to create the space of peace, to voluntarily associate. And from there is the only path that leads us into a good future.
So, that's where it's a little bit ambiguous with Girard, because he points out that scarcity is often the occasion for scapegoating. There's that word, the elephant in the room, the scapegoating, the sacrificial violence that communities have used to create peace and order. And he's good about that word, remembrance. We're remembering the body at our primordial past that we have torn asunder to create that peace, that we can have skin in the game, but it'll be somebody else's skin in the game that binds us together. That's where we get the word religion. The Latin root is to bind together. What are we binding together? We're binding together a community around a shared corpse, a shared, at the earliest levels, cannibalism, eating someone's body and drinking their blood, which unfortunately is at the root of a lot of the records of human culture. So, when I think about that, Jordan, did we lose you?
No, I'm just thinking really hard.
Okay.
We're in a space right now where
Yeah.
it behooves us to be thinking really hard.
Yeah. Well, what I'm trying to suggest is this idea that scarcity triggers this sacrificial devouring that we do, and we're still doing it. It doesn't give us the peace anymore. As Girard said, the Jesus story comes into history and disrupts our ability to unanimously come together around who should be the villain and who should be devoured. Now, we can't agree. We're still trying the scapegoat mechanism, but it's not providing the heroin. It's not providing the high. It's not providing the bound up togetherness that we used to have. It's creating ever more schism the more we try that old trick, that give me that old time religion. Remember that song?
Yeah.
We're trying that old time religion.
Well, you sure see it everywhere, don't you?
Yeah, we're trying.
Spend a little bit of time in the Twitterverse. And
they're always, who can we cancel today? And they're trying so hard, but they're never going to get it back. It can't come back.
Who's the bad guy?
Yeah, because the Christ story has destroyed that trick. That rabbit trick has been destroyed. It hasn't destroyed the appetite for it though. That appetite's still there, because we're.
Yeah, can I throw something else on top of
that?
Sure. So let's pivot. Let's pivot from the mythopoetic for a second and pivot back to the real concrete. The Oppenheimer also destroyed it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The war got real complicated in 1945. It used to be that we look collectively at the bodies of the dead in our war, our shared sacrifice, and we had purged, exhausted the energy of the conflict and the blood, in this case almost universally for quite some time, over the 20th century at least, of the young men who died in the trenches. Around about 1945, we found ourselves in a very uncomfortable situation where we got right up to the threshold and had this thing looking back at us called mutually assured destruction. And we had to start figuring out how to shift the boundary conditions of how we exercise that impulse,
Mm-hmm.
the impulse of fuck you, the impulse of punch you in the face or hit you with a rock.
Right.
I think there's a finding that it's very powerful. Like that's an embodiment of the Christ myth in a sense, right? I think I've said this on a previous conversation, I think with Jack Murphy, which was, for 2,000 years, we had a story where we were invited to live in a certain way. For the past 100 years, we've had a story where we have to figure out how to. We've got no choice.
Right.
And every day, how would I call it? The pit gets wider and deeper and closer to our toes.
Right.
In 1945, let's make it 1962, just Khrushchev and Kennedy could have plunged the world into nuclear abyss, just two guys. And all they had to do was not push the button. But every day in every way, we just get better and better at killing everybody, right. Which means we got to get better and better at not killing everybody. And that age-old 13.5 billion year habit of when push comes to shove, pushing and shoving, we have to actually figure out how to not do that. We have to actually learn how to anchor ourselves in that space of peace, to consistently and always, as individuals and as a collective, to make that choice to freely associate. And it's right there. It's just, I feel like we sort of, if we step back and just sort of look at it, we can tell that we're currently right now living in two worlds simultaneously. You can feel the energy of the Girardian conflict, the scarcity mentality that at any moment wants to just tear apart the whole story. Pardon me. And on the other hand, the other side, salvation.
But that's the question that I was, because the ambiguous part that I was alluding to is the idea that, well, yes, scarcity tends to be the occasion for the impulse to find a scapegoat to resolve the tension. If there's a famine, if there's a plague, if there's lack of resources, if there's a murder spree, whatever it is, something creates scarcity of life, scarcity of food, scarcity of existence, scarcity of order, scarcity of resources, scarcity of health, and that triggers this hunt for the scapegoat. So we're still trying that today, but my question is that some people would suggest, and there's a quote, I think it's Dostoevsky or someone that says basically that if we would resolve all scarcity issues, if we could resolve all material want, would human beings stop their conflict? And it's like, no, there's something about human beings that you could meet all their needs and they would still find ways to create eternal dramas. So that's my question is it really, I rack my mind about this all the time because I'm always on the hunt for things that could provide solutions for scarcity. And I think about, all right, let's find energy too cheap to meter that's abundant. What would that do to alleviate the social pressures to attack everybody based on collective identities and nations and bombings and all these things? Would that reduce it a little bit? And then what if we could have, cures for cancer and Alzheimer's and diabetes and all these terrible things that people are stressed out about? They have this latent death anxiety and it bothers them knowing that people they love around them will have these afflictions that don't really seem to have any resolution or cure. Imagine we could just cure all of those different things in our lifetime. So we cure pollution, we cure energy scarcity, we cure diseases that have been afflicting and scaring us. Would we still have the same level of conflict, or would it reduce it?
That there is Jabba the Hutt, right? That's the thing where the thing that's actually the problem, which is the fear at your heart, right? So to be the basis of your choice is fundamentally anchored in fear, and you try to solve that by endeavoring to extinguish scarcity in the outside, and you create a cornucopia of muchness, and you've actually not solved the problem even the least bit. You haven't stepped in fact, in many ways, you actually get more fearful in the core. And there's another way, right? The other way is to sort of recognize that the only 0 to 1, the only real bit that flips, the only real change that could ever happen is at that basis of choice. how much are you able to have the basis of choice, the thing that is at the bottom of how it is you're coming into the choices that you're making? How much are you able to achieve coming into that place from a space of love or peace or grace, whatever term you'd like to use? And they're all part of the same complex that can't really be named, or fear or sin, right? That's it. Because, and we have plenty of stories of people who've been able to make that shift. And if you come from that place of love and you perceive a possibility of material scarcity, real scarcity, the way you relate to that real scarcity is just completely different. Contrary-wise, if you come from a place of fear and you're sitting in a world of absolute plenitude, you're still an asshole. You can't help it. Greed will still drive a lot of your choice making. So the question is, how deeply can you ground yourself in that other place? And it doesn't mean for the least bit you're going to get rid of the aspect of reality that is bounded by thermodynamics. And that's still a fundamental characteristic of reality. What it means is that your choice making will not be dominated by that characteristic of reality. Your choice making will first and foremost be coming from this other location. And it will be, now we're back to the loaves and fishes, right? As a parable, your choice making will always be saying, let us think more deeply. Let us consider more fully how it is we may find a way to achieve abundance in this space if we can maintain the capacity to not be at each other's throats. Now, we're 13.6 billion years into this game. We've got a lot of instincts that are oriented towards scarcity. It'll probably be another 13.6 billion years before we can be so fully anchored in the other side of that equation that we can feel like it's a real forever all the time. But there's definitely a sort of a 50-50. How often are your choices coming from one place to the other? How aware are you of what's the basis of your choice? To what degree are you unconsciously acting at a scarcity? And to what degree are you able to say, oh, shit, sorry about that. I just made a choice out of this place. How well can you come back into this new basis? How well can you recover when you get kind of knocked off your path? Can you say, oh, I'm off the path. And before I do anything else, because if I'm off the path, most of my choices are probably going to create harm. Before I do anything, how do I get back on the path? How do I, the 12 steps? How do I, can't remember what the third step is, but it's somewhere in the direction of how do I atone for the trespasses that I've made against others while I've been unconscious, while I've been off the path. That's just skillfulness, right? It's not that different in some sense from learning how to juggle. Not easy, but you can do it. And once you've done it, it doesn't mean you're perfect. It doesn't mean like if you're juggling and somebody comes and shoves you that you're not going to drop the balls. But it does mean that you can do something. There's a skillfulness and the capacity to orient yourself towards this basis of choice anchored in grace and love, become more and more capable of staying in that place and knowing when you're out of it and always knowing how to come back to it. And then, of course, in that place, everyone who has that skillfulness has a capacity to be in relationship with everyone else who has that skillfulness that is oriented towards generativity. And that is the basis of true plenitude. And I think this is the real conflict, the real competition. There's a competition between the instincts that are oriented towards scarcity, which is to say, well, first and foremost, I want to be the boss. And I want to make everybody else be my crony. You remember something called the rules for rulers?
Oh, go ahead. What's that?
It's a really good case study of the logic of scarcity and how important, how fearful a dictator must be of the people who are directly underneath them. Because, of course, no human can ever rule a tribe of people. At the end of the day, each of us are just one person. It's only people allowing themselves to be ruled. And they allow themselves to be ruled in a series of surrendering their sovereignty. And so if you're the boss, you're the boss by virtue of the 5 to 10 people who directly are underneath you, right? The people right underneath you who are your enforcers and perhaps your operators and your organizers. Each one of them looks at each other as a rival, right? It's rivalry at the top, more so than anything else. But if you're good at what you do, you can use the rules for rulers and keep things hanging together and maintain yourself and your cabal as being at the top of the scarcity pyramid. And of course, you want to make absolutely certain that everybody at the bottom of the scarcity pyramid is also making a local game theoretic choice to not pull together with anybody else at the bottom of that pyramid, lest you be overthrown. And so that's the game. Right? The game on that side of the equation, the game based on the basis of fear, is that game. Right? How do I maintain myself and my cabal at the top of the scarcity pyramid? And how do I manage that pyramid through hook or by crook? Right? I can lie, I can bribe. Think about how Saudi Arabia manages its population. Right? It's got a small cabal of people who are aristocrats on top, and they got lots of resources. So they just make sure that they make the people fear violence enough and appreciate, seek violence little enough that they stay a well-managed herd. Right? They stay in the cattle zone of humans. And then, and the pyramid maintains, right? That's one structure. And of course, it's a structure that we've seen for a long time.
That's the domain of the sacred you just described. The idea, that's the domain of the sacred, that sacred violence staves off profane violence, right? And so
that's the second. The second one is where sacred violence staves off profane violence. Right. The first one is fear of profane violence maintains a tacit agreement to stay in the profane. And a big piece of the profane is to simulate and also to parasitize the sacred. Think about the movie Star Wars. You ready? I'm going to go straight 1970s kid for you. Old George Lucas did a terrible and horrible and wonderful thing at the same time. He tapped into Joseph Campbell, and he crafted a parable tapping into our mythopoetic sacred, right? The deep roots of sacred, which every child who watched that movie is like, oh, okay, that, my instincts that have been born through a lot of countless generations trying to sense what is right and what is wrong. That story resonates with it. And by the way, when I look around me watching Saturday morning cartoons and TV commercials, I don't see much of it. So even though it's a thin gruel of mythopoetic sacredness, it's more than nothing. And then he proceeded, and with the good help of the folks at Disney, even more so, to strip mine the sacred as maximally as possible to feed the Jabba the Hutt character in the profane and make us lose sight of the difference between the sacred and the profane. But there is a difference, right? And the other side is the sacred violence. The other side is the not rules for rulers, voluntary association. We've got a goddamn term for it. People actually recognizing that to come together entirely voluntarily, out of wisdom, out of a felt sense of the reality of community, that we are in fact all part of the brotherhood of man. It is inevitable and has always been thus. We are family in a deep sense. And I don't mean that artificially, I mean that really, to actually do it. And going back to homesteading, you get 10 strangers and you have them build something together and have them live or die by the virtues of their own hands. And 9 of them will actually become family. Typically, one of them will still be kind of an asshole. Not necessarily, but you got to keep your eye out for that one. Because that's part of the story as well. Right. So I think that we can continue to tap on that distinction between the sacred and the profane, the distinction between the fear-based scarcity mentality, not scarcity itself, but the mentality that is using fear to maintain its, if one of us is going to starve, it's going to be you. And the state of grace of being in the abundance mentality, which says, well, neither of us needs to starve if we work together.
Right. As long as we stay in that scarcity-driven mindset, we'll cling to the failing drug of sacrificial violence through the form of political violence and coercion and so forth. I mean,
and all of its ancillaries, self-delusion, in fact, straight up drugs. We got plenty of them in the body of this society.
Yeah, I do think it's an obvious correlation between this. It's weird how there's this, you get this idea that some folks will say, on the right even, liberalism or libertarianism is the failure of our culture. This idea of individual rights or individualism and autonomous individuals. And I think to myself, wait a second, libertarians don't have any power. That's not their fault. But what they are getting at is there's this weird relationship between a culture's individualism and the rise of tyranny. It's this weird thing how it works together. If you have this individualist mindset, somehow we get more and more collectivist and more expansive in our government, right?
It's beautiful. Well, I think it goes like this. I think it's really a 2 or 3 step process. You feel a wrongness in the world,
right?
And it's a felt sense, right? First and foremost, it's a felt sense. Second, you can't fix it. You yourself, and by you I mean yourself and the real and the relationships that you can count on, don't seem to be able to solve the problem. Now what do? And typically what we do is we escape. One place you can get to is you can deny the problem. You can make up a story that points the blame at something and renders you virtuous. And those are the two moves, right? The first move is you find something which is vice, you point the blame at something. And the second thing is you render yourself virtuous. Some folks escape into libertarianism. And they point the blame at authoritarianism or at collectivism, anything ends in ism, and renders themselves virtuous, the autonomous, individual. Some folks escape into social justice. They point the blame at fill in the blank and always render themselves virtuous. But that's the third move, right? The first move is there is a felt wrongness. Second move is you feel powerless.
Right.
The third move is you escape. Now, the problem is if you're sitting in that third move and you're trying to figure out how to solve things from the third position, you're going to reinforce the second position because the third position can't solve anything. Right. It only makes things worse. And the worst part is it makes things worse in a way that actually creates simple categories for other people to start dividing and conquering. Oh, I'm a libertarian, and the social justice folks are clearly collectivists. So it's not just collectivists in principle, it's collectivists in practice. And by the way, they don't like me. They yell at me a lot. They point the finger. They seem really mean and angry, and sometimes they even punch me. So now I've got a reality that's the fourth move. There's a reality that is in fact really real, which increases the reality of the wrongness, but it's actually tied to the third, which was never real in the first place, which is tied to the second, which is real, and all the way to the first, right? So you get real lost and you get confused, and this is what's going on right now. You can see it like surging through social media. If you just sort of step back and watch social media with that lens, you keep seeing people who are fundamentally powerless, fundamentally feel powerless. So they keep making up stories to try to feel somewhat agentic. And then they mistake their stories for reality and become actually powerless.
So it's this, again, it goes back to when you're in a stagnant universe, at least you feel that way and you can't grow the pie. The only thing you have to do is to turn to your neighbor and say, well, it's the choices you've made. It's your race, it's your gender, it's your ideology, which is causing the suffering in the world. You need to be quarantined with all guilt quarantined onto you. You need to quarantine all guilt onto you and cut it off. That's the scapegoat mechanism. It's still trying to happen.
That's nice.
Put
it in other places, right? You could put it into the stone on the ground.
Right.
I think everybody's had that experience as a child, is stubbing your toe on a stone and blaming the stone. And first and foremost, think about it. That's a very nice, simple example. I don't have to be too highfalutin.
Right.
I'm walking along and I stub my toe on a stone. What happens? Well, I feel pain. And the consequence, the cause, is in the past. Can't change it. I'm in fact actually powerless. So I feel uncomfortable and I'm actually powerless. So now I have a choice. What do I do? Well, the energy of pain is an energy of change. I want to change what happened, but I can't because it's in the past. So one of the things I might do is I might blame something. I could blame myself. Well, that's uncomfortable. I could also blame the stone.
It's funny you mentioned
you kick the stone.
That's the metaphor for the gospel transformation in the Bible, scandalon, the stumbling block that you stumble onto in the field. And that's the scandal that causes either mimetic rivalry, because when Peter confronts Jesus and he says, you're not going to die on the cross. We're the 99. We're going to go beat the 1%. Okay. It's time to have the revolution, Jesus. You've got a movement here. Your poll numbers are good. Let's storm the castle. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, which means get behind me, accuser. You are a stumbling block to me. So you're a stone that I've stubbed my toe on. You're trying to draw me into doing things the way of that scarcity mindset.
That's right. That's right. That's a real, it's the silliest thing to say. That's a real insight. Yeah. Yeah, it's a real insight. I think it's crucial to land though, right? Because it's too easy. You can't help it, right? You kick the stone. There's a whole lot of instinct that says, well, maybe what I should do is kick. You stumble on the stone. Maybe I should just kick the stone. Maybe the stone got in the way. And it's even harder because you have to realize that the first thing you have to do is you have to recognize that the pain probably pulled you out of your connection to the sacred.
Right.
You've been pulled back into the profane. And if you can build a capacity, now we're very simple again. I stubbed my toe. My toe hurts. A capacity to actually first and foremost recognize what it feels like to be pulled into the profane and to slow down, take a breath. Look at your toe. Is it pain or is it harm? If it's harm, is it harm or is it real damage? Do I have to actually deal with something? If I do, let's deal with something. If it's just pain, Are there any things that I could have done better that I can use to change my capacity to move forward in the world? If no, then it's in the past. It is simply a part of reality that happens to occur. If yes, then let's grow in that direction, as challenging as that may be, which having a 2-year-old at home, you see that 2-year-olds don't really have too much of a trouble with it. You know, they stumble and fall, they cry because that's what happens. They allow the crying to pass through them without getting too hung up on blaming anybody. Then they figure out how to get better. And you can just be like unto the child and learn how to learn from your mistakes without blaming anybody. It's probably a pretty good ancillary to that particular rule.
Yeah, the kingdom of God is like children. That's what it's about. Yeah, that's the idea. To have that childlike lack of desire to scapegoat and tear down something else. I think that's a picture to what we're trying to describe.
Yeah, and it's funny because, and I want to name it, we're having a conversation which has a feeling a bit, it's not theoretical, but it's living in the domain of language. And yet, I'm sitting in my chair using a computer to talk to you over telecommunications infrastructure, and you're at a makeshift version of a booth because we're quarantined.
Right.
Voluntary quarantine, at least on my part. I suppose in some sense it's always voluntary, and that's important to recognize.
Right.
But things are afoot. Normality is definitely not going on outside. Right. I think was it yesterday where the Pentagon had that whole aliens thing, and everybody looks at it and goes, "Yeah, it's going to take a lot more than aliens to weird us out these days." So I'd like to invite people to accept the reality of the signs, the reality that you can actually look around and go, "Oh, this is that thing. This is the telling us that we're right now in the process of making a real big choice of whether we spiral down into the inevitable spiral of mimetic desire, into conflict, into chaos, into terror, or we take this stumbling block and we stumble up and we acknowledge, oh, that's right. I have to remember the difference between the sacred and the profane, and I have to return back to the path before I do anything else. And how do I proceed forward in this space more deeply in the sacred than I was before, and find all those who would be friends, in the Quaker sense, right? The society of friends, the society of those who agree to support each other in maintaining their individual and collective integrity in the shared space of peace and grace in the sacred, and then build from there, right? Because that group of people, a group of people who enter into an agreement around that kind of a shared directionality is the only possible way out of this mess.
Right.
We're not going to get there by pointing fingers, and we're not going to get there by having a boss tell us what to do. I don't know if you've noticed, they're not very good at it. And we're not going to get there by blaming the boss either. It doesn't make anything any better.
That's the revolutionary counter spirit that imitates the spirit of the state itself. Yeah. Both of them are the same thing, and they both lead to destruction. Revolutionary overthrow and the imposition of the old order. They're identical twins.
Yeah, that's identical twins.
Look, I'm a Christian, so I'll continue to go back to the gospel story, because it gives you all the tools you need. If you look at it, you have the story of the two Jesuses. There was two Jesuses on trial there with Pilate. Barabbas.
Yeah, okay.
In the original text, in the earliest manuscripts, he's named Jesus. They took it out because they thought some of the scribes were saying this is a little too close to home here. This is a little too edgy for us. They said, how could the guy who's a profane killer have the same name as the Lord? So they missed the point of the actual gospel text, and they took the word Jesus. So there was a tale of two Jesuses in the story of Pilate. You have Jesus, Barabbas. Bar means of, Abba of the Father. So you have two Yeshua of the Father, two Jesuses of the Father. So the question the crowd has to choose is, which Jesus do you want? Do you want the Jesus because remember, Barabbas was not just a serial killer. He wasn't Jack the Ripper. He was a revolutionary. He was like William Wallace. So the word they used was a revolutionary overthrower. So he was the Jesus that Peter wanted Jesus to be.
Oh, wow.
Remember, Peter was like, wait a second, you're not going to die on the cross. You're not letting up your power. You're not letting go of power. You're not doing that. We have a thing here. We can have justice. We're going to take you into the throne. You're going to be the president. You're going to be the king. But there's a Jesus there that offers that. That's Jesus Barabbas. And Pilate says, which guy do you want to let free and which guy do you want to kill? And the crowd chooses the Jesus who tried to overthrow things like William Wallace did. And they choose to kill and butcher the Jesus who said, oh, Jerusalem, if you had only known the ways of peace, but they've been hidden from your eyes. Now,
Yeah.
I think, here's my thing. I think the one danger, and I've told this to Jordan Peterson in my interview with him, is that we cannot keep the story of Jesus in the domain of the mythic poetic. I don't think it's just another archetypal story. And I think if we don't see that we will miss how different it is from the dying and rising savior myths of our mythological past.
Ah, nice.
Does that make sense? So if you think of Jesus as just learning abstract ideas like clean up my room, okay, that's fine. But if you don't actually see it as a tangible human person you can actually imitate, a real historical person, then you don't have any basis, I think, to actually try to do this contagious positive mimesis of imitating.
I like that a lot.
Do you see what I mean? You need a concrete, real human person to imitate. And so what we've done is we're so Christian we don't realize it, that we don't want to acknowledge the concrete reality of how the story of Jesus's life has transformed the world. We're so Christian that we feel the need to defer to those other remember what he said, if you want to be the greatest among you, you've got to be a servant. So we have that servant's posture for all other religious ideas. They're all one mythological goop. You see what I mean? We get that idea because of how thoroughly Christian we are. Does that make sense? We've turned this into one mythological, ethereal goop of archetypes. But we make that mistake for a few reasons. One, because we're more Christianized than we want to recognize. We're more, if you want to be first, you have to be the least of these. You have to serve. You have to wash the feet of those below you. And so we say, well, we self-flagellate. We self-flagellate the religious inheritance that has built the West. Oh, it's no different. It's no distinct. It's not superior to any other ideas. But every other, that's a unique attribute of the West. This desire to self-criticize, to self-flagellate. Does that make sense?
It occurs to me that there's actually a very simple solution to this. How do I say it? What is it? And the truth shall set you free. I think that seems like that's the answer. Which is what I mean by that is this: if need be, and with Jonathan Paggio, I will agree that it is ideal if it not need be. But if need be, I can simply wake up tomorrow morning anew with no memory of any stories that anybody's told whatsoever. I don't necessarily need to have the mythopoetics of any story, including the Jesus story, because it's just truth. If all I do is pay attention to what is in fact really true and to what reality is telling me, I will recover those stories where they are most true. Now, this will be a very challenging thing to accomplish, right? And I will be very unlikely to accomplish that in practice because the world is vast and I am small. But nonetheless, if you use that as your compass, and you say, oh, well, we've been given an orienting basis. We've been given a way to make our job a lot simpler. How to find our way onto the path, and a bunch of parables that gives us some clarity on what kinds of things work and what kinds of things don't work, right? But it's about a practice, and it's about actually. I think you in fact were saying it's just the thing that you're supposed to be doing is actually learning how to live it better and better, and learning how to embody it.
Right. But you can't. But the difference is there is a distinction between Zeus and Jesus as a role model.
Sure. But you don't necessarily.
Horus, the dying, rising god of Horus, is different from Jesus. Does that make sense? Because Horus, he's repeating the same cycle of the profane, of trying to maintain order through the sacrifice of one. What Jesus' story does. He doesn't create unity with his resurrection. He creates division. all other reported resurrections in history that humans believed in created unity. His creates division. Because in his all mythological stories that Girard points to, this is why he became a Christian. He saw what he believed in, a physical resurrection of Jesus. Once he understood that it was the revelation of the concealment of that eternal return, that Nietzsche talks about. Nietzsche understood it too, by the way. Nietzsche understood what was so special about the Jesus story that he was terrified of. He was terrified because he believed that it had destroyed the sacred. It had destroyed the order of the universe that had kept things in place, the hierarchy, the unity, the peace. It had destroyed it. And he was afraid. He was afraid that not enough people could ever fully imitate Jesus to ever save us from what it had done. That Jesus' story had blown things up, but human beings were incapable of actually imitating him to the point where it would bring a new order in the way Jesus envisioned. You see what I mean?
This is the story of the last men, which is where we so far we are right now. Right? So in Nietzsche's vision, as I'm bouncing it off of you, there's a move where the order that we were talking about earlier, the order that was created by the profane violence, holding back the profane violence, was in fact destroyed. And that's what
Jesus, exactly. Just to hold, you're right. It's profane violence holding back profane violence that we used to think was sacred. We thought it was sacred. Jesus says it's all profane.
Yep.
If you kill one because the whole story with Pontius Pilate, it's better that one man die than the whole nation perish. That's his statement. That's not Pontius. That's Caiaphas. Caiaphas says that. He says it's better that one man die than the whole nation perish. And that's his logic for murdering Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And so the story, that's the breaking of the fourth wall for the text right there. It's breaking the fourth wall all the way through, but it's really close right there that you see it. It's not better that one man die for the whole nation, that the whole nation should not perish. That's the whole story of Jesus' story.
Yes, right. If you think about it, going back to our earliest metaphor of scarcity, right? The mentality of, well, that guy's going to have to starve to death because we haven't got enough fish to go around, right? That's that mentality, right? It's better that one man died than the whole nation perish. It's better that we agree that particular individual, we haven't got enough fish to go around, people. We're going to have to agree one of us is going to have to die, but we have to make that choice to save the rest of us.
It's better that we put a drug dealer into a rape cage called prison than the whole nation perish if they're addicted to the drug. It's better that one tax evader gets thrown into a rape cage than the whole nation perish if we don't have a tax system based by force. It's better that everything.
The blanks,
yeah. The whole system.
Once you're on that slippery slope, you're on that slippery slope, and you can.
And that's where we're in. That's the system that we're still bound up in, that we're trying to free ourselves from.
Yes, I concur with that assessment. And then the other side of it is then the challenge, the burden is upon everyone to choose to endeavor to live in the fashion that Jesus describes, and to actually accomplish that goal with enough of us so that we can actually live on the other side of that transition, on the other side of the eye of the needle, right?
But it's not Simba. It's not Luke Skywalker. Yeah. I want people to see that Simba and Lion King and Star Wars, those are Christianized, but they're still completely pagan myths because it always resolves with the murder of the enemy. With Jesus, it's the opposite. Yeah. And we don't like to tell that story.
Well, it's interesting too. Wow. So let's try this on for size. I'm not sure if this is right, but it just popped into my head. I've been talking to John Vervaeke. In fact, I'm talking to him again later today. And part of that conversation has been about the salience of the dramatic story. The story of Luke Skywalker killing the bad guy and becoming the new noble king sells. People that's a sexy story. Oh, wow. How does that work?
And technically, he doesn't kill the bad guy. To be fair, his father kills the bad guy.
He actually redeems his father who kills the bad guy. But nonetheless,
but there's still a killing. There's still a sacrifice. There's still a witch that had to be burned, and that was Emperor Palpatine. What Jesus does is Jesus says, look at Emperor Palpatine. He needs to be loved. He needs to be brought into the camp. Emperor Palpatine only looks like that because he has leprosy and he had a bad childhood. That's what Jesus does. Nobody watches that movie.
Right. That's the
Nobody
key, right?
watches that movie.
That's the key. I've talked a lot. Well, it's funny. I've talked a lot with the people who I talk with very closely. I don't think I've even said this out loud, but this one of the things that my heart has definitely told me many times is that we need to move into a post-narrative world, which is merely to say a post-drama world, a world where we acknowledge the reality that peace may not be as salient. It's not as potent a drug as drama, and it's the simplest thing.
Yes.
If you take a look at, I remember watching teenagers talk about this in the context of television when cell phones started showing up, and the classic drama in a social interpersonal drama is the drama of confusion.
Right.
Person A thinks person B did or thinks X, and so they go off into some kind of dramatic conflict. And of course, the teenagers go, well, why don't you just call them? Well, let's just act like mature grown-ups and just have a conversation about the miscommunication and maybe the hurt feelings or the fear that you have about what's going on. If you can actually, maturity dissolves drama. And it's interesting how addicted we are to drama, because drama sells. Drama is a story that likes to be told. Drama is repeated. We gossip drama. We very rarely gossip healthy stories of maturity, solving problems in a simple and rich and sustainable way. So that's another addiction we're going to have to figure out how to shake.
Well, that's why even the church has reinserted pagan elements of God's character back into its own story, because it's hard to sell a God that has no scarcity in his love. He has unconditional love. That doesn't sell for human beings. Right. We like gods that are made in our image, that give tit for tat, that give push-pull, that give what we call seduction. I love you, but I might kill you. I love you, but I might blow your whole village up.
Well, and also
you know what I mean?
For a bargain. Right? We're like a God who cuts deals.
And what Jesus says is he's forgiving his enemies while they're murdering him. He doesn't say, "I'll forgive them if they get me off this cross."
Yeah. Okay. So this is good. Here's a shift, and I think try this shift, because I've struggled with this a lot, and I think I've found a comfort with it, which is let me see if I can do this right. Okay. So remember that structure I gave earlier about first wrongness all the way down to fourth. Okay. Now, if you're sitting there in the pits of fourth, and somebody comes to you and says the phrase unconditional love, quite often the way that you imagine that is kind of like unlimited money. And you think of it as, oh, I can do anything and still have approval, something like that. You don't actually know what love even vaguely means, and therefore unconditional love, you haven't got a clue what it actually means. Now, if you think about it in the context of just good parenting, so every parent should give their child unconditional love. And I'm going to say that absolutely categorically. Right? If there's anything in the world that I believe with experience, it is that. Now, that does not mean that every parent should indulge their child by giving them their approval. Certainly doesn't mean that every parent should give their child unconditional candy, right?
Right.
Candy and love are not the same thing.
Right. There's still boundaries, right?
Unconditional love is a crucible more than it is anything else, right? Unconditional love is that I make a commitment to so fully love you that I seek in all ways through that love to support you in becoming the highest version of yourself. And I'm in partnership with your soul. And your soul is not kind. Right? Your soul knows that to grow, you have to go through. There's an undergoing in growth. And to unconditional love is to be fully in relationship with your soul's calling for you to grow into becoming who it is you are to become on this earth, which may actually have a great deal of suffering involved. Right? If I see a man on the street, I actually remember this, and I'll sort of out myself a little bit. I was in an ayahuasca ceremony. And the question, the inquiry that I put to myself was the question of what is mine to do? And as it turns out, in the ceremony, there was a young man, probably in his early 20s, who had been able to get his father, his grandmother, and his aunt, but not his mother. I don't know what happened there, to join them. And they were definitely not the kind of folks you'd expect to be in this kind of a scenario. And Dad was sitting next to me. And Dad had a very tough time. And Dad was undergoing some serious suffering. And I think he may have been a Vietnam veteran, so he was going through some world-class suffering. And part of me wanted to reach out to him. And I was feeling his suffering, and I was feeling oh my gosh. And then all of a sudden it just came clear to me, oh, this is my lesson. My lesson is to actually love him unconditionally, which does not mean to carry his cross for him. Quite the opposite. Is to actually figure out with as much discernment as I can muster, which may not be much right now, precisely what is mine to do in relationship to him, and precisely what is his to do in relationship to himself. And that's parenting again, right? Parenting as a child. Your job as a parent is not to lift your child's burden, and your job is not to put on your child a burden that's not theirs to carry. It's to support them in growing in their own capacity, to discover for themselves, to build in themselves an increasing capacity to notice what is theirs to do and how to actually hold the cross that is theirs to hold for the whole and for themselves to grow into who it is they're to become. It is an infinitely challenging task, and you will always get it wrong. That is it, though. That's the whole story. That's the beginning and the end. And I would just call that friendship, by the way. Once you recognize that every relationship is that relationship, and every relationship where you either try to lift or to impose a burden that is somebody else's is a sin, is an error of the most grievous sort. And that your own journey is a journey that gives you more capacity to learn how to discern that. Then I think we're starting to get into deep stuff.
Well, that's what Peter was trying to do with Jesus. He's like, don't die on a cross. I'll stop you. I'll save you. I'll protect you. And he's like, you don't know what you're talking about. You're still operating.
Peter, come on.
Yeah. But that's the thing.
By the way, Peter, I got bad news for you. You're actually trying to put down your own burden, which is the burden of witnessing me on the cross. Right? Be mindful of the fact. You're actually trying to avoid your own cross by pretending to carry mine.
Right. It's not until they reportedly see a resurrection with Jesus that they actually understand what he was doing all along. Mm-hmm. Up until that point, they were bound up in the crowd too, and abandoned him in his moment of persecution. It wasn't until they saw the empty tomb and physically went to their deaths. And it was also interesting that they used, women were reported to be the first witnesses. So if they wanted to make up a myth, why would you put women at the time when they would be considered not even worth any kind of credible testimony in the court of law? So if they're trying to sell you on a lie, they wouldn't put women as the first witnesses to the resurrected Christ. They would because they know that would be worth like a child or in terms of court testimony. So they see something they really truly believe, and it transforms everything that they saw to the point where they leave all their embarrassing moments in the Gospels, that they miss it over and over and over again. It's a very transformed text, because they're the villains in the whole story. The guys that are the leaders who preserve these gospel stories. They're getting it wrong over and over and over. Who will rule when your kingdom? No, guys, it's not going to be like that. Hey, Jesus, you're walking on water. We're scared. We're going to stay bowing in this boat. He's like, no, guys, get up and do it like me. Walk on H2O with me. You know what I mean? Be me. And then he tries to spell it out for us, but we still don't get it, because he says, eat my body, drink my blood. I mean, how much more visceral can you get to the idea of imitation than that, right? Because he's calling into, when he does that, he's calling us back to our unknown origins, that we created order. We created language. The first symbol, I agree with Girard, that the first symbol is the sacrificial victim, cannibalized for the propitiation of the community, for the atonement, for the coming together of the stress of scarcity and death anxiety and all that stuff. You come together and you eat the body, you drink the blood of a common victim. That's the origins of human civilization. So Jesus is intentionally calling that into play, I believe, when he says, eat my body, drink my blood, meaning if you want to take out your pain and suffering, blame me. If you want to take out somebody, make me your punching bag. If you were raised in a church that you felt was oppressive, blame Jesus. Take it out on me. I can take it. Don't take it out on each other. If you need a scapegoat me. Eat me. Don't eat each other. You eat each other every time you try to lord over each other in your business, cutthroat practices that exploit people, and your desire. You're eating each other constantly. It's all based in cannibalism. And that's the whole reason why the church is called to eat and drink in remembrance of the body that was torn apart, right? You're recalling the origins of the human species every time you partake of the Eucharist. And you're
But at least you
recalling it
should be.
in a satirical, yeah. But that's the thing. It's the joke's on you if you don't get it, because what happens is we end up actually to really participate in the Eucharist is to renounce and to acknowledge that all of our ways of being are founded on that hidden moment of cannibalism that we think we're way past. Does that make sense? It's a satire on, when you partake in the Eucharist, it's a satire on human beings. It's a performative art that you do. It's performance art. You're satirizing the pomp and circumstance and the decorum and the grandeur of human civilization, because you're recognizing that underneath it all is a corpse that we partake of together.
Yeah,
right?
I'm just reflecting on this narrative of the injection of salience, the injection of drama, the injection of formalism, the injection of pomp and circumstance and lights and fanciness, right? Special effects, putting special effects on the story that has the advantage of getting a farmer to give you his attention for a little bit. It has the disadvantage of missing the whole point, which is neither here nor there. I mean, I certainly haven't done a particularly good job of conveying anything of any means. And, to the degree to which the church has been able to do anything at all for thousands of years, that's miraculous in and of itself. But going back to where we are, I've said it out loud, so I'll say it out loud here. I really do believe that we're getting pretty close to the point where we're going to have to actually figure this out for real. If it's not in this particular crisis, I've called it a meta crisis, just to kind of give it context. Right? A meta crisis is revealing the fragility, the fact that the profane violence, holding back profane violence, is barely holding it back. If it's not this particular perturbation, there's another one coming and another one, and they're going to get bigger and they're going to get faster until either the thing breaks and we find ourselves tumbling down, or we figure out how to go through the eye of the needle, or something along those lines. And it's not going to be long. And I don't mean that in terms of I was not raised in any meaningful sense a Christian. So I don't mean that in a revelation sense. I mean that in a very practical sense of, when I take a look at economics and I take a look at geopolitics and I take a look at flows of molecules of energy, I take a look at innovation, I take a look at mimetics, right? I take a look at physical phenomena happening in the world, and I understand things like catastrophe theory, which is a branch of mathematics. I understand self-organizing criticality. I understand complex system science. I understand fragility, right? I understand all these things. What I do is I say, there's a storm of brewing. It's a thunderstorm. There's going to be a lightning bolt, and it's going to happen in the next 24 hours. Right? I can do meteorology on this thing. And I'm saying we're getting pretty close. We haven't got a whole lot of time. And so this is for me, it's a very practical exercise. Like I'm not in the least bit kidding when I say what I'm saying, at least in terms of my own life. And how we pull that off, well, let's hope that it's, how do I say this? Let us hope that the miracle of the loaves and the fishes is closer to hand than perhaps we believe it is.
I think one of the steps that gets us there is recognizing that the knowledge, and it's happening, but that the calcified, enshrined bodies of knowledge that we believe to be sacrosanct are actually mythically enclosed more than we believe. And that once we begin to think about that, and it's scary, because this is where you'll realize how much social pressure is actually built into what we call knowledge and science. And that the sooner we start to have the courage to speak out about these things and think critically about what is nature. And I would say, people dismiss the idea, and I'm just using this as an example. They dismiss the idea, of course, Jesus is a story. And I would say, yes, the most important thing is to imitate the character of Jesus and not quibble about some of the fights about dogma. But I would also say that people would say, that of course there's no such thing as a physical resurrection. That defies nature. And I would say, well, how do you know what nature is? If you don't know what nature is, how would you know what supernature is, above nature? If you don't even know what real nature really is, then how can you even begin to give us a credible critique of, oh no, this is outside of nature? Because I know what nature is, that's outside of nature, therefore it's supernatural, it's a myth, it's fake, never happened. Now I would say that one of the things that's going to help us break through to the other side is, as a species, is to recognize that our settled science for so many things, including things as simple as the atom, are so much in the dark, we have no idea. And we have to have the humility, the epistemological humility, and the courage, most importantly, because we're afraid to call out icons of knowledge of what's the atom, what is nuclear energy, I'm just taking that example. That we're so afraid to question that because we don't want to be socially shamed as alternative physics or pseudoscience or quack. We're so scared of the mimetic social pressure that builds up these institutions. We think they're science. We don't understand how religiously structured they actually are. Thomas Kuhn gave us a little clue with the idea about faith being the edifice for reigning scientific paradigms. But I think if you take Girard and you take Thomas Kuhn, you might have a better picture at how much we need to re-question things that we think are settled science. Does that make sense?
Of course. I could not agree more strongly. I think it's, and again, I like the false dichotomy you put out there. And it's very similar to the one we were talking about earlier. Like we created a sort of a false distinction between authoritarians and libertarians, and recognize that false distinction is what causes both of those to begin to show up. They co-create each other and could not exist without each other. Same thing happens here, right? Your sort of scientific authoritarian has to categorize critical thinking as pseudoscience, but that does not mean there isn't such a thing as pseudoscience, right? Of course, there is magical thinking, and it's out there too. And unfortunately, magical thinking has to categorize. Magical thinking has to identify rigor as authoritarian. And you get an error and you get trapped. You can't actually be in that place in the middle where you're trying to be humble. Humility, right? Neither position has a lot of humility. Both positions are very righteous about their rightness. But if you have a place of humility around reality, then you're in a place of being able to say, all right. I mean, if push comes to shove, and most of the times it doesn't, I'm going to assume a whole bunch of things about the nature of reality. But generally speaking, my job is to create as much space as possible, to be as open as possible as what reality could give me, because that's how you do things. That's how you learn new things, right? So yes, and by the way, you can also work it backwards. As it turns out, you can actually take a look at scientific revolutions and start to see when they occur and how they occur and what their characteristics and trajectories look like, and say, oh, we're actually kind of due for one. We've been sort of spinning in an increasingly landlocked miasma of stuff not moving around for a while, and this is usually a sign that a break is about to occur. So what does that mean? Well, it's hard to know. It's very hard to know. I certainly agree with Nietzsche's point that we do not yet know what the body can do, which is just another way of saying, let us be humble in the face of what is real.
How can you advance the world of atoms if you don't really know what an atom really is? That's the way I think about it.
That'll definitely slow you down, won't it?
But to have the courage to even speak about it publicly. I mean, even the most radical, innovative brands that we can think of, we're still trained. We don't realize how mimetically enclosed we are we're afraid to say, well, I don't agree that monocharged particles exist. When they say, well, who are you? Are you one of the established priests? Who are you? What school did you go to be catechized? How many papers from our established class of folks with billions of government and political dollars protecting our established class? Who are you, and have you ever had one of your papers come close to meeting our treehouse? It's a treehouse. You're not in the treehouse. Do you know the code? And so everybody says, well, I want to be a respectable person. I need to make money. I've got a career to go. I'm not going to question anything. I'm just going to sit down and shut up and hope that somewhere down the road, someone will have the credentials to challenge, like Martin Luther, the church of science. See what I mean? It takes someone from the inside, usually. Martin Luther was a monk's monk, and you had to have a monk's monk come in there and say, hey, I'm an insider. This is all BS. A whistleblower.
Well, sure enough, because, this must be very clear. Physics is a real thing. There's they can do a lot of stuff. They can make transistors. They can make laser beams, right? You can do real stuff, and it's hard, and there's a lot of work put into it.
Well, hey,
I don't understand it deeply enough to exercise a true critique of physics.
Hey, Ptolemaic views of the world were very good at charting ship courses.
Yep. And if you didn't know it from the inside well enough, you were going to have real trouble. So you need one of two things, right? You either need somebody you need Martin Luther to come and say, hey guys, I need to sort of share with the hoi polloi what all of us kind of know, which is the emperor has a lot less clothes than the emperor likes to pretend, which maybe is the kind of thing that Eric's been about. Or you need to actually do something which is truly powerful and new. It doesn't require you to get permission from the church.
That's right. That's it. That's the thing. That's what has to happen. You have to, I know this is going to sound weird, but it's like the miracle of the fishes and loaves. You've got to do demonstrations.
So let me give you just my mind there. So, all right.
That's the way science used to be done, by the way. Tesla would do a demonstration in the public. You didn't have to have some beer. You'd like, look at this. This is AC. Imagine if he had to go through the peer journals to get his stuff out. Nothing, we'd still be using what? DC current frying our heads?
Check this out. I think this is going to be great. I think this is going to be a really nice piece, particularly for everybody or anybody. I don't know if ever anybody ever listens to these things besides the two of us. And as far as I'm concerned, that's okay, because this has been a good conversation from my point of view. All right. So if I was going to try to really chip away at the pseudo-sacred edifice of science, I definitely wouldn't go after physics. I wouldn't go after biology neither.
Why, is that the Holy of Holies?
It's the Holy of Holies, and it's protected by a lot of veils, right? I don't understand exactly how to do all this stuff there. I dropped out of high.
You go behind that veil, and you'll see a lot of mirrors, man. A little funny house of mirrors. Where am I looking?
Yeah, and I can tell when somebody's trying to bamboozle me, but at the same time, I've spent a lot of time. I don't know. Murray Gell-Mann is the guy who created a big piece of the Standard Model. I've met Murray. Very smart guy, right? And working real hard to try to tell the truth. Right? So I'm not casting any aspersions at physics, but I wouldn't go after the Holy of Holies, largely because it's strong, right? It's a solid edifice, and it's done real stuff. They build nuclear bombs and lasers, man. It's hard to impeach. I wouldn't necessarily go after chemistry or biology. I'd go after economics, because one, those fuckers don't know what the hell they're talking about. They are full of shit, straight up and down. Two, they like to pretend like they're doing science, right? They put on the robes of science, and they put on the hats, and they carry the scepters, and they sort of stomp around and say, "No, we're physicists," and therefore control all kinds of stuff. I think like the asymmetry. Physicists have pretty solid stuff and create real things like laser beams and nuclear bombs, and that don't actually have that much influence in how the world works in terms of what they say. Economists,
they don't have much influence?
Not really. Like Richard Feynman.
I would say I think it would be in the background, though. They are so rarefied that their influence doesn't have to be manifestly made known.
They have very, very deep influence around the Holy of Holies, and I'll grant you that, and I think that's right.
Yeah, I think I have just to add to that. I think that's because I call it the Mowgli effect, the Jungle Book effect. Whoever discovers the fire is the one who's the king of the jungle.
Oh, nice.
And so whoever creates the fire of nuclear bombs that can blow the whole world up automatically gets the keys to the kingdom as the highest, most rarefied knowledge. So you go through, they will not be questioned because they have fire.
So my point is, I wouldn't for everybody who's not in the center of the Holy of Holies, it's very difficult to, and I would say even potentially impossible to go after physics. And you can't speak to it at a personal experience very well. But economics, you sure can.
Right.
Economics, the science is not even vague to science. The empirical evidence is 180% the opposite direction. I remember in 2008 sitting there and watching people like Paul Krugman and writing down what he said, and then checking it a few days later and saying, that was wrong completely. That was wrong completely. All right, so these guys have a real cool habit of saying things out loud that are absolutely impeachable, historically, empirically. And yet, right, and yet they are inside the temple. Right? They sit next to and play roles with as if they are also doing science. So if I wanted to unravel that sweater, I go right there. If you start unraveling the sweater, lots of things start to change, and then you'll find yourself eye to eye. Because remember, what holds the physicists in charge is, as you said, at the end of the day, it's budgets. Right? At the end of the day, it's the ability to say, young kid who's getting a PhD, you're thinking real interesting thoughts. If you'd like to get to be a professor and get paid to do physics, probably ought to think slightly different, interesting thoughts, right? But if they didn't have that ability, if anybody could think what they wanted to think and not have to kowtow to those guys, then their power would go away really quickly, because then reality would reestablish itself.
Well, also, if the state wasn't, I mean, this is an economic way to look at it. If the state wasn't funding science, we'd find out the truth of the physics and chemistry and a lot of things a lot faster, because money would be allocated towards solutions that actually work and produce real results. That's the way science used to. Yeah.
That's where I'd go. Right, I'd go after. I mean, where does science meets reality at economics? Because economics touches on the market. But
so you're saying if you were going into the temple, you'd go after the money changers before you opened the veil, right?
I would go after the money changers. That's exactly what I would do.
And after he went after the money changers, eventually the veil was ripped and there was no one home in the Holy of Holies. You see?
Is that right?
Yeah. But that's he does the money changer thing. He goes after the economics guys. That gets him killed, and as he's killed, it says the veil is torn and there was no one home.
Oh wow!
There's nobody there.
So that's
in the Holy of Holies.
I reckon we ought to go after the money changers first.
So how do we go after the money changers? Do you have all right, I'm going to give you I like Austrian economics. Do you don't like that? I'm sure you're.
I'm very familiar with Austrian economics, and I would say by and large I feel good about it. The problem I got with Austrian economics is that it what do you call it? Fetishizes. It worships that golden calf quite specifically, and I think that's not quite as accurate as it should be. But I definitely take a solid.
But wouldn't a true Austrian just say money should be up to the market? So if they want to use wampum or seashells, they can. If they want to use Bitcoin, they can. I guess that's the no true Scotsman argument. To be fair, I do not position myself as being among the theology of Austrian economics. So I cannot tell you what a true Austrian would say. Right.
I can tell you that most of the folks I know who present themselves of that lineage,
they like gold. Yeah. So you're saying we need something new to storm the castle of economics, or is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I think we do.
What does that look like? Is there something being developed in that vein, or you're just saying it's something we need to do? It hasn't been done yet.
I think a lot of things, frankly, have been developed. I mean, ever since our friends at Bitcoin cracked open the code of saying, "Hey, why don't we think about money? Why don't we actually just contemplate that as the sort of thing that we don't just prior to Bitcoin, money was either the government makes it magically and we kind of don't think about it too hard, or a small group of guys with dust on them said no, it's gold, and that's pretty much it, right? After Bitcoin, a whole bunch of people are like, well, I'm just going to kind of think about it. My sense is we can hit that. We can hit money, and my guess is that it actually ain't that hard, to be honest, because I'll give you an example. One of the things I actually did a video on universal basic income. You can take a look at it. And I said, the way I look at it, I think about it not from the point of view of trying to use the metaphors that have been produced by the economics profession, because I'm going to be right out front. I think the economics profession, up until maybe, I like the old guys, like the real old guys, the guys who were doing this stuff in the 1900s and the early 20th century, because I think they were earnestly biologists in the botanist sense, like they're collecting, like natural scientists. It's when you get to the more current generations that I get real skeptical. But I think about it sort of the market. It's supposed to be collective intelligence, right? That's what it's supposed to be. The market is a way to have everybody benefit from the perspective and the insight and the intelligence, the actual capacity to separate reality from illusion of everybody else. And it's a tool to do that. And so the brain is also a form of collective intelligence, and so is a network. Okay, cool. Let's try to look at neurology, neuroscience. Let's look at graph theory, network theory, and let's look at markets and see if there's something we can learn by taking all three of those disciplines and sticking them together into a single transdisciplinary container. And my answer is more or less yes. In fact, we can. We can get some really, really good ideas out of that. We can do a restructuring of how the collective intelligence of the market operates to create something which does the thing the market is supposed to do well, like actually do the thing that it was promised. But just recognize there's some insights into how network topologies, like use evolution. The brain is evolution, trying to figure out how to get a whole bunch of neurons and perceptors and actuators to coordinate into a highly effective decentralized mechanism. Okay, great. Let's do some biomimicry and see what does that tell us about how markets maybe ought to operate. And then, of course, network theory gives us the ability to actually do real-time simulations of that same underlying set of questions and understand a whole bunch of things using a variety of actual, like either A, how our networks have actually evolved, which we can see now, but it gives us data. We can actually see it with precision. And then B, we can actually run simulations on it. So those two vectors, if you kind of double click on that and say, let's rethink these concepts, not fetishize economics in the way that physicists have been fetishizing physics. Let's just be aware of the fact that a lot of the things that we may think are true are in many cases, maybe less true than we think they are, or we hold them too close, and start looking at it. And I think we can do some really good work fast. I don't think it would take us very long, because let me pause on that for a moment. Let me go one more sort of piece of theory that I think is pretty important. Because we go back, we talked about this in terms of Peter Thiel's proposition, and my proposition, and I think many other people's, that something happened in the 70s. Things went awful sideways. One of the theories to which I ascribe meaningfully is Schumpeter. I feel like our friend Schumpeter actually hit the nail on the head pretty well. Creative destruction. In fact, specifically S-curves. And my sense is that round about the mid-70s, we were beginning the process of the end of that era, and that we should have been moving into a truly new era. But unfortunately, there were powers that be that had the capacity to prevent that from happening. So instead of truly moving into an actual new era in the 80s and 90s, which is when we should have been in the childhood of that era, we went through the Great Moderation, which also ended up as the Great Financialization. And that constraint, we still got some stuff out of the new era, right? We got computers, but computers ended up being an artifact that was appended to the existing structure maximally, minimum disruption, maximum appendage, and was mostly financialized. And so you got something like Microsoft, which is this grotesque capture of the energy of what should have happened and turns most of it into money and most of it into minimum disruption, for example, just as one piece of it. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is we should right now be sitting in a mature next thing, right? School should have changed. Banking should have changed. Governance should have changed a lot, right? At least as much as what happened between 1914 and 1945, right? That period of transition between the Victorian era and the modern era, a lot changed. That same amount should have changed between 1972 and, say, 1999, somewhere.
Why didn't it?
Well, we can talk about it in detail if we'd like, but I'm just going to say that the capacity of the institutions of control to control the profane power that was holding back profane violence was able to prevent the disruption that would have violated its own capacity to be in power.
Right.
The combination of removing the capacity to connect with reality through money, the ability to remove the capacity to connect with reality through narrative, right? Both narrative, addicting generations on fantasy through television, and the ability to manipulate those generations through the power of propaganda and television. Putting every child through industrial education, which narrows the mind and turns it into an optimizing effectiveness machine.
I think it also biases the left brain hemisphere.
Bias of the left brain hemisphere.
Ian McGilchrist, I did an interview with him recently, and we talked about that, how our institutions of knowledge are left brain hemisphere biased.
Very powerful, because the right brain, if you listen to it at all, has been going fuck for a long time.
So I thought it was more like
and so anyway, you end up getting this also in the economy. Right? Think about what happened when they said, okay, we're going to take all the folks who are able to tap into that right brain. Let's take Jim Morrison and let's turn him into a celebrity which makes money and has celebrity status. And then let's turn that into a market. And here I'm using the word market in the negative sense, right? Not the positive sense, which is to say that which to the profane. Let's turn the sacred into profane. Let's turn that thing which is here to liberate us, and let's turn it into something which actually traps us even more deeply. And then also demoralizes us around the sacred in general, so we can't even connect with that channel any longer. And every version of that channel in the future starts looking a lot more like John Bon Jovi and less like Jim Morrison. I'm dating myself. Pick your favorite version of the sort of high salience, low relevance rock star. Madonna, even better. Lady Gaga, perhaps. So that's a piece, right? So there were techniques and capacities for control across all dimensions of society that had a vested interest in maintaining that control and had a capacity to do so, sadly enough, at least adequately to hold. In evolution, it's called niche construction. So the dams were built, and the levees held back the river in spite of the river's desire to shift its banks. So we should be sitting in a mature other place, right? We should actually have developed a lot of capacity and competence. We actually should be a very different people right now. Nonetheless, a lot of that work was actually done. A lot of that work was developed by strange, weird folks who were living in corners all over the place and thinking thoughts and trying to figure things out on their own, sometimes just unable to play in the game that was set before them. And I can just invoke my friend Eric and Brett as examples of that.
So those folks are hanging out in the wilderness where the scapegoats are.
That's right. That's right. Hanging out in the wilderness where the scapegoats are, and quite often being scapegoats on not rare occasions. And most of the time being broken and destroyed and rendered incapable and voiceless. But a lot of work was done in that period of time. A lot of work has been done. So it's not so much, I think, our job is to invent from scratch. I think a lot of our job is to actually rediscover and to synthesize and to integrate and to redeem and to bring back into right relationship and to recover. Which is an easier job.
It's very good. Very good. Because what you're saying there is it's interesting to me, because I'm going to use that story of the Christ story again, just to kind of give you a picture of what I think you're getting at here. There's these scapegoats out in the wilderness, right? And they have these knowledge projects that they're working on. And our job is to bear witness and bring that scapegoat back into community. In the same way as this, what happened, I always call the Gospels the gospel technology, because what it is it's a piece of media written from the vantage point of the scapegoat rather than the winning crowd. Up until that point, all myths had been written from the vantage point of the winning crowd. And to this day, we believe in something called the Oedipal complex, that Oedipus actually killed his dad and had sex with his mother. We still scapegoat him by our own psychological inheritance of our modernistic science. So what I'm saying is all history had been written for the winner's crowd. And then the Gospels are a piece of media that say, actually, no, if you take the camera and play the same action sequence, but give the camera to the scapegoat, you'll see a whole new universe. And what I think happens here, this is why I call it a technology, is if we imitate the gospel writers and take the camera of history and give it to the scapegoats who've been banished to the hinterlands, then we'll see the same sequence of events of what is economics, what is physics, what is all this stuff, nutrition. Yep. And we'll see it play out from a different angle, and it will allow people to make progress and move ahead as a species. But
no question.
So this goes back to the wonderful point, which is media technology. Back to McLuhan. We're back to McLuhan. Media technology is what allows us to imitate the gospel technology of handing the cameras to the banished scapegoats who have been banished from the institutional spheres of biology and so on, and psychology and anthropology. Girard was banished from anthropology and still is to some degree, and economics and physics. And we hand those camera views. That doesn't mean all scapegoats are right? Because when you're out there, because some people are scapegoated because they're wrong or they're annoying.
Let's be very honest. There's a whole bunch here. So what I would say is that the part of that we've done the first part. Right? The first part is we've been able to, we can move the camera. We have the capacity to move the camera, which is a big thing. I mean, that's why I did it. Why I focused on that so much back in that period of time when I was an entrepreneur. I mean, explicitly. That was part of my senior thesis when I was in college, was exactly that.
How to move the camera from the oppressors to the hidden
You got to,
victims. Right.
right? If you want, the first move you have to make is you have to change the underlying topology of the media landscape. If you haven't done that, nothing else is going to work. Once you've done that, there's a lot more to do, but at least you've got a chance.
Right.
All right. The second is we have to relearn how to tell the truth. That may be all, actually. Move the camera and relearn how to tell the truth. And by tell the truth, I mean it in both directions. Right? On the one hand, it's the direction of to express the truth, right? To speak with honesty and integrity and clarity to the degree to which you can. Right? To tell the truth is a skillful practice as well as an integrity practice. And to discern the truth, to tell when truth is being told. Right? As a listener, to be able to listen clearly and to notice when what you're hearing is poorly spoken truth and support making that better spoken, and notice when what you're hearing is in fact skillfully spoken lies, and notice and how to get that out of the way, right? So to learn how to tell the truth is a collective process of development, of parenting, of friendship, of unconditional love, that crucible of growing. Those two pieces, right? That it. Change the underlying topology of the media landscape so we can move the camera to the scapegoats. And the second is relearn how to tell the truth. Get those two things right, and we probably have everything we need.
Tell the truth. What does that mean, tell the truth? Does that mean telling the truth about fake news? Because fake news and mythology are the same thing, right? Fake news is the vestige of mythology. Fake news is the vestige of being able to shape events and represent them in a narrative which is dishonest, which doesn't tell the truth, which puts little scare words around Joe Rogan, the alt-right, blah, 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 that whole thing. That's what that's mythology at its vestige. Little pieces of it are still there. They're still in us, right? We're still still holding on to those shards of mythic lies that get us to.
I'll give you a few pieces, because I think this is a whole practice. It's a whole discipline in the sacred sense, perhaps in many ways maybe the most sacred sense. Let me do some sort of simple ones first and maybe do a deeper one after that, because it feels to me like it's going to take a little while to get the deeper thing to settle into clarity, if at all. One of the things that I noticed when I started creating some YouTube videos, and I should be very clear, I don't know how many YouTube videos I created, maybe 30. And then now I've got this friend of mine who's my friend's son, who's just creating more out of some videos I've done. Probably on one out of this, because I think this really bits in this conversation. So my, I was writing on Medium. I wrote maybe 50 articles there, and I got to the point where it was just a lot of work, and felt like it was more work than it was worth. So my wife said, "Well, why don't you just say it in a video? Maybe you could just record yourself saying it, because you say it, you talk to people all the time. Why don't you just record it and then just share it?" So that's what I did. Right, that was the beginning and the end of the whole thing. All right. Now, one of the things I noticed, and it came in two flavors, was there was clearly a deep sense, a fundamental assumption that if you're expressing yourself at all in public, you must be endeavoring to build a brand. That if you are not being a good marketer, then you've already missed the boat. Right? To say something insightful, it can only be valuable in the context of building a brand. And when I say that in the sense of, like, people would come to me and say, you're saying interesting things, but you're not going to get 1 million viewers if you don't do X, Y, and Z, like those kinds of assumptions, right? The objective is to get a lot of attention. Ideally, attention that you can own and presumably monetize. I don't know about that part. So that's one side. The other side was very similar, but even more powerful, which was a anger at my failure for having done so. So one side was kind of like a hint. I assume that you're trying to build a brand, and here's how you're not doing it well. The other side is actually anger for not doing a better job at building a brand, at being
right.
Whatever the right marketing, having good marketing. So one thing would be to dig into that and disabuse yourself of that as an unconscious assumption and bias, right? To tell the truth is to orient towards the relevant, not towards the salient. To use Vervaeke's language, which is good language, and a man who does a very good job at this. That doesn't mean to be obscure. I apologize publicly right now for the degree to which my speech has been obscure. I admit a significant lack of skillfulness in communicating the kinds of things I'm trying to communicate clearly, and I've endeavored over decades to do so. You should have seen me 15 years ago. Doesn't mean to endeavor to be obscure, by no means, right? Clarity is part of being able to tell the truth. If you're not speaking clearly, then you're also doing it poorly. but to speak seductively is also to do it wrong. Right? So seductive simplicity, seductive obfuscation, and truculent obfuscation are all errors in telling the truth. Right? So to build skillfulness in expression, which is able to orient towards the most relevant, towards the most insightful, that's another one. That's one. Here's another one, and this is actually going deeper. The truth is not propositional. Those who read the book should know this more than anyone else. The words are not the truth. Right? I cannot convey the truth to you by telling you a story in the words. The words, if you take the words and you separate them from the thing that motivated those words to be spoken in the fashion that they were, will be lost. Right? As soon as you copy it once, you've lost something very deep. The truth is to be found in that thing which coordinates and ordinates the words to be the ones that are selected in the orientation that they're selected. Right? There's a generator function. There's a transcendent essence. There is a truth is transcendent. Right? There's a thing that cannot be said that nonetheless is the thing that is expressed. Right? I must speak it for you to hear it. Right? I must draw it for you to see it. But we can both perceive it in the transcendent. And what I'm trying to do when I speak and when I draw is to give you hints to orient you into your own mode of perception, such that we are suddenly both perceiving the same transcendent object in the way that we do. And then to coordinate us. So the speaking is not in the words. The words are a protocol, a way to create a communications channel so that we can become coordinated in our mutual perception of the transcendent. That is another deep, deep thing, to learn to tell the truth, right? To learn to become a communications channel, to learn to actually achieve fidelity with each other and to mutually perceive the transcendent in a shared way. That is the deepest, or a very deep sense of that.
It reminds me of the Johnny Cash song about the man in black, and he says, there's a line there that he says that I think kind of puts this into contrast for us, that there is a false transcendence. And the false transcendence, again, is the domain of the sacred, of the scapegoat mechanism. The shared transcendence that people feel. Let's say, let me give you an example. Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann. You know those names.
Yep.
Why is Stanley Pons hiding in France to this day? Let me just think about that for a second. Stanley Pons has gone off the grid for decades, since 1989, when him and Martin Fleischmann passed away. But he was one of the world's best chemists, Martin Fleischmann. So you have Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann, and they come out with this announcement that they have created what they believe to be cold fusion. And to this day, we have an American, Stanley Pons, who has renounced his U.S. citizenship and has been in France in obscurity since, in hiding. He was so shamed and vilified. Now, that's the Christ story. It's not the complete story. There's no vindication. He's still as we're speaking, there's a man who tried to do something, and I think he was earnest.
Yeah.
And I think they made mistakes, but he was vilified by the high priest because he touched the Holy of Holies. He said, here's a nuclear reaction. And they said, you said nuclear? You're a chemist. We're physics. Let's talk to you. Come to my office. We are the physicists. We outrank you in the Jungle Book, okay? Because we have the sacred fire. We created the bomb. You just use the word nuclear, you come to our office immediately. And all of the institutions and MIT and all the different media, sycophantically, they raised them up like a god at first, the media did, and then they tore them down as soon as the high priest said, like Caiaphas, it's better that they die than the whole nation perish if the integrity of nuclear science is destroyed. Right. That's what they did. Yeah. And there's a man right now who did a tabletop experience that produced excess heat and has been replicated by other people for decades since, also hanging out in the hinterlands of the scapegoat, and we're not allowed to have a conversation about it in polite society. Why is that? And what does that tell us about the way our bodies of knowledge are structured? There's a man in France. We talk about science as the domain of intelligence, the domain of rationality. There's a man in France who was disgraced for doing an experiment. What about that at all sounds rational? What about that process looks like the highest order of human, togetherness or human understanding. That sounds like old-fashioned religion to me. That sounds like somebody spoke out of line and said, I don't agree with your model of the Trinity, and they said, beat it.
Yeah.
You're done. Get out.
And by the way, we need to make sure that nobody else shows up any vaguely like you. So you got to be real done, right?
And to this day, if you type in, it's now called LENR, low energy nuclear reactions or whatever, there are still little groups in the shadows working on it. And every now and then you'll get an article in a third tier science magazine, maybe, oh, there's something there those crazy people are doing. Who knows? Maybe. Who knows? But wait a second. The premise that you could create nuclear type energy in a tabletop device, isn't that the biggest story in mankind history? I mean, isn't that what, but no one's talking about it. We're talking about,
Let's just do the generalized thing. So let me if you don't mind, can I hold 2 points?
Sure.
All right. So the first point is the scapegoats who have been wandering in the wilderness. We need to love them unconditionally, and by that I mean in the crucible, right? So because they're going to be fucked up. There's going to be a lot of damage, right? It ain't easy to walk alone in the wilderness, and it's even worse. So I mean, both in terms of they will have emotional, developmental issues, right? And I am among them, so I know of what I speak. I'm not sort of pointing at other folks. And I spend a lot of time with these kinds of people. They're the kinds of people who I like. Here's another thing. They'll have actually had to be without a community, thinking about things in their own private language in their head, right? Which is they're going to have usually a very odd language. And they use words differently than other people next to them use words because they've been using their own words for a long time. And they may actually have concepts that are 4, 5, 7 levels of conceptual complexity deeper than we're typically using, right? Because we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Which means that we tend not to think too hard about what those giants did. If you've been out in the wilderness, you've been thinking about, Einsteinian, Riemannian manifolds, and you're like, you know what? There's this branch, this other approach that was being thought about in 1487. I'm going to take that branch, and you may have built something up, right? Well, there's going to be nobody who has a clue, right? And they're going to be very confused and maybe a little angry at you, just because it's hard to understand what you're talking about, right? So we need to be very mindful of the fact that in many cases there's going to be a difficulty in communication,
right?
And there's going to be emotional fragility because they're used to being beat down, they're used to being yelled at, they're used to being not understood. And if they're holding something valuable, that's going to be even more intense because they have a deep thing that they've been trying to figure out how to share with the world, right? So we need to be aware of that. We need to have compassion. We need to actually learn how to create a context that is able to support them in communicating and giving their gifts back into the world.
They're bumping up against the domain of the sacred because they're challenging the false transcendence that if we're unified on this as settled science, then together we can bind ourselves into a corporeal body called physics or whatever. And we don't question our forefathers. We don't question Moses. Right. We don't question Feynman. We don't question the fathers of these edifices that we've built because we've done all this empirical experimentation and we have all these equations and we have all these credentials. We cannot afford to question hundreds of years of established inherited knowledge. And to do so is to bump up against that transcendence, that catharsis, that out-of-body experience that I am a part of the communion of what is called X, physics, or whatever it is. And that's why they have to have that vicious anger to excommunicate people because they say, you're destroying reality itself. You're destroying our religion. It is all human beings are designed to have worship and religion. You can't escape it, right? You can't escape the sacred.
Ah, right. Yes, so you're destroying our power and you're destroying our religion.
And you're destroying our sense of unity and togetherness. I don't like this physicist and this guy doesn't like my thing, but together we've settled that this is the way the atom is. You see what I mean? Yeah. That's how you bind together. And when someone comes along and says, no, the atom's not that way, then the shared togetherness of, no, we hate each other except we come together on these shared dogmas. And you're saying that dogma's not there? That means we have nothing to bind us together. That's apocalyptic for people in all fields of knowledge.
All right, so let's go to the second point. Okay. So this is an example of that notion of thinking about money differently or economics differently. I actually made this proposal to the Obama administration in 2008, which didn't go anywhere, but I donated meaningfully to the Obama campaign. So I had we call it rich folk access. So I got to talk to people. So the proposal was this. I said, look, we currently spend X. I'm just going to call it, let's call it $100 billion. We spend X on science. And you guys are about to dump a ton of money into the economy. Remember, what was it called? Not TARP, but the Rebuilding America infrastructure bill.
You're not talking about cash for clunkers, are you?
No, well, we might as well be. It's the same thing, right? And you're going to do a terrible, terrible job at it. I'm just going to tell you right now. You're going to waste trillions of dollars. Why don't we waste trillions of dollars intelligently? Like, why don't we fail forward? Here's a proposal: $100 billion a year for the next 4 years, 5 years. If you want to pretend like you're going to transcend your being president for the first term, allocated into a platform where every American citizen has the ability to prove their credentials, get your social security number, whatever it happens to be, get your identity, and each American citizen is given a pro rata share of that to allocate to any scientific or engineering endeavor that they see fit. And so you basically take that money and fully decentralize it. And of course, the first order thought is, well, you got two problems. One is people don't know what they should be funding. People are dumb. And the second is people will there'll be some real corruption, right? People will give money to their friends. And my response is, number two, yeah, and probably vastly less than is currently being corrupted, because they're not as good at it as you guys are, because you've been at it for a while. And number one, I'm not so sure. I get the distinct sense, and I said, here's the math, right? The math looks like this. When you run an optimizing function on a system that can create niche production, it can maintain the integrity of its own institutional fabric. What you end up getting is you get increasingly narrow, deep investigations, right? So if I take a look at physics and I take a look at chemistry and take a look at biology, it tends to have this root structure that looks like a plant, where I've got these sort of deep tap roots that go like that. But if I look between them, there's these big dark areas between these two roots, right? So I've got real deep investigations of increasingly esoteric areas and vast territories in between that aren't being investigated. If all I did was broke the structure so that the money was effectively random, like I literally said, I don't care if it's randomly allocated, it could just be randomly allocated, I would be willing to bet you would get one full order of magnitude and possibly 2 orders of magnitude increased discovery in practical science through this program, right? So that's an example of the kind of thing of like, you know what? Let's just use basic sensibility. When you've been going at something for 50 or 60 or 80 years with the same basic institutional structure, you can be damn sure that it's a bad combination of corruption and bureaucratic cowardice that focuses on increasingly narrow and oftentimes cover your ass, like don't investigate anything as long as what you do looks like investigation. And if all you did was pop that thing open and make that money available to go decentralized, you get a 10x increase in performance almost immediately. My battery's about to die, so I got to move. I think our time is up too.
Yeah. We're
missed a call. So, and we could do that, right? That's not that hard these days. We have a technical basis to make that extremely possible. If we could get the ear, if one could imagine a situation where all right, I'll go two pieces and maybe we'll end on that. So right now we're not just wasting $1 trillion, we're wasting $10 trillion and probably more. And wasting, like seriously, massively wasting. Like to prop up the too big to fail banks is an absurdity beyond comprehension. If you think about it in terms of like parasitism, and then what would it be? Sophisticated enemies, parasites, and then things that just aren't very efficient. The banks are somewhere to the left side of that continuum, and they're certainly nowhere near need to be around. All right, so if I'm dropping $10 trillion into the economy just to stave off deflationary spiral, maybe we could be a little bit more clever about it. We could actually do it in a new way. And there's a lot of cool ways you could do it, right? You could just, like I just said, I could just create a whole platform and say, hey, American citizens, here's what's going to happen. Each of you are going to get $50,000 to invest over the next 36 months. And we're going to do it in a cool digital way. And the way the investment works is it's going to be like the Work Projects Administration. You can't give it to yourself. You got to give it to some other project. When you create a platform, people create projects. Everybody's going to get money that they invest. The first move is you have to invest it in another project. And yep, there's going to be some corruption. A lot less corruption than you see in any other project that gets funded through any existing bureaucracy. But we're going to get a level of creativity the likes of which we haven't seen in 100 years. All right. And maybe it's not $10 billion. Maybe it's just a trillion. Maybe it's just $1 trillion. But think about it. Think about the insanity. All right. That's one. Now, The naive part of that is not the topology I just described. And by the way, I can give you a topology which is 100 times more effective than that if we just sort of thought it through a little bit. The naive part of that is not the topology, obviously, right? The naive part is to assume there are any ears to hear at the top of the choice-making structure that would even vaguely consider that as a thing to do for about 50 different reasons. That's the second move, right? The second move is we're going to go ahead and have to take sovereignty back. I got bad news for you. You're not going to be able to vote for anybody in sort of ordinary voting. Right? We may be able to continue to vote for a while. That may actually still have some legitimacy. But it's not going to be a situation where a politician is going to come to you and make you a promise you're going to vote for that. We're going to have to take sovereignty back. That's the only way this thing happens. The people are going to have to wake up and say, whoa, shit, we've been sitting around not doing anything for a while. Jefferson and the boys kind of did a good job. And our friends back in the 1860s and the 1930s kind of did a rev to this thing. But at the end of the day, the buck stops here, and that here is right here. So we're going to have to step in. We're going to have to look around, say they aren't going to save us. And most of the time, when they say they're going to save us, they're going to be screwing us. Take responsibility back, figure out what a right design looks like, execute on that design, and either force them to do it or just do it ourselves. And because at the end of the day, like I talked to somebody about this in terms of like a big company, let's say Google. Google's not real. There's no Google. There's a whole bunch of people who do things. And they've agreed as people to do things in a certain way, according to certain hierarchies and certain rules and processes. And that set of agreements becomes the thing that we know as Google. If those people change their agreements, they'd be doing something else. And Google would no longer exist as a viable entity. That's the whole country, right? The whole country is every single thing you have, every structure that you think that you see that is real is not real. It's people making choices on what agreements they want to make. We can make new agreements. We can always do that. That power has always been rested in the people. Sovereignty is that, the ability to make the choices that you make and own the responsibility for those choices and to make the agreements that you want to make. I can tell you right now, there is no path through this that does not go through us as a people, reclaiming sovereignty, making the choices that we choose to make, to own the choices that we're making. Take responsibility again, right? Sovereignty is responsibility more than anything else. And then begin to make new agreements. And maybe we can execute on that through the vote, right? But if we do it, it's going to be more like this. It's going to be, Steve, sorry, man, you're the one who's going to have to be the representative because you're kind of good at that kind of thing. Here's the list of things you're going to do. Your job is not to figure out what to do. We've already figured out what to do. Your job is just to make sure it gets done and report back when it's done. Our representative is going to be our representative, not our boss. Right? We're not looking for them to have ideas. We're looking for them to just get shit done if we vote at all. Right? So that's the last part. Right? Let's be not naive. Right? Remember that first is to recognize a wrongness. Second is to feel powerless. Third is to actually create an illusion. Let's awake from our illusions. We're not powerless. We're just uncoordinated. Right? We're just self-powerless. We pretend like we're powerless because we haven't had the courage to fight a war, right? To have a warlike disposition, to have the commitment to say, okay, worst case scenario, if we go in this direction, and by the way, it's bizarre, worst case scenario, our standard of living gets cut in half. Yeah, things might get rough, which means we return to like the 1980s standard of living. And maybe I don't get an iPhone 11 for another 18 months instead of 6 months. Come on. There's some toughness, but it ain't seizing the beaches of enormity toughness, right? So we're not hopeless. We're not helpless. We're just cowardly. We just are refusing to accept responsibility for the whole of the Commonwealth. As soon as we recover from that cowardice and choose to recognize that the responsibility is where it always has been, at our own feet, and begin the process of saying, all right, who's got ideas? Let's talk about it. Let's figure it out and live by the rules you just mentioned. And just learn how to tell the truth. Stop trying to bullshit people. Stop trying to get attention. And stop, Venkatesh Rao wrote a really great article on the Internet of Beefs. Just exit the Internet of Beefs, man. That's just silliness. Stop playing in that game. That's just a stupid game. It's a lame. It's a dumb game. Be friends. Learn how to be friends again. Right? Learn how to engage in what it means to engage in voluntary association. And it's funny. The thing that I've noticed over the past 2 years, and I've made a distinction. So there's a way of thinking about it in terms of Team Blue and Team Red. And I think that distinction creates a little bit of confusion and more tension than it needs to. So I'm going to make a slightly different distinction. And some people might be laughing when I say it. I'm going to make a distinction between Team Must Have and Team Nice to Have. And Team Must Have are the folks where if they decide to leave, everything falls apart. And there's a lot of them. Right? We're seeing them right now in the food chain. Team nice to have for folks who, if they stop doing what they did, either we wouldn't notice or we'd be glad they did. You know, we don't need this. And that's really an interesting thing, because as I've noticed over the past 2 years is when I have conversations with folks who are on team must have, they tend to nod their head at what I'm saying. And if they disagree, we're able to disagree honestly. We can usually find a compromise that works. And usually it's a collaboration that actually is a better solution. I think largely because if you live your life actually having to solve problems with nature, you know, the way I've described it in the past is if the pipe bursts, do you grab a wrench? Do you call a plumber, or do you call a supervisor? If you grab the wrench, you tend to have a certain set of capacities to figure out how to solve problems with other people, because you're aware of the fact that no matter how much you complain or whine or cajole or manipulate, nature's nature. You better just figure out how to make it work. If you call the super, that gets really problematic. You use words like problematic, because most of the way you solve problems is you figure out how to convince other people to do the things you want them to do. And that's a totally different game, and hard to collaborate in a space of people who are optimized for manipulating other people to do what they want to do. So anyway, so largely when I'm saying what I'm saying, I'm actually speaking to team must have. I'm not so much worried that right now about team nice to have, because if team must have gets its act together, looks around, says, we're going to take responsibility for this thing. We're going to design it. We're going to sign up for it. We're going to accept the fact that it may be rough going for a little while, but we're going to go there. We're going to make it happen. And we're going to make an offer to team nice to have to join on the terms that we've defined. And they're good terms, right? We're actually, it's a much better world we can get to. Right? We can get to the promised land in a Old Testament sense. Team nice to have is going to take those terms pretty quick. So that's what I got to say about that.
That's very good. It's not going to come through government bureaucracy or universities that have that power, because that would be like Henry Ford trying to position himself to introduce a new way of transportation. And at the time, there's a Department of Transportation that says, excuse me, what are we going to do about the horseshoe makers? We're the ones running this bureaucracy. You see what I mean? If the horseshoe makers are in charge of the Department of Transportation, they would never allow the combustion engine in the automobile to exist. And so we've got to stop asking permission of the horseshoe makers of reality and just start creating the technology that people need.
Yep. Yeah. Every one of these institutions was created by regular old people.
Yeah.
There's nothing out there that's created by anybody who's radically smarter than the people who are hanging out right now.
So the myth of the man is really just us, isn't it? It's just the crowd. It's just people. Well, very good. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Jordan. It's a wonderful conversation.
Yeah. Very nice to meet you, sir. Look forward to seeing what happens.
All right. Take care.